I'd like to welcome everyone to our session on data silos, and specifically in this section, we're going to address how the RDCA-DAP platform is working to break down data silos. I'm joined in this session by several colleagues representing different stakeholder communities. I will kick things off talking about the what with respect to data silos. My partner in crime, Amanda Borens, who heads our Data Collaboration Center and specifically very much involved in this effort for the RDCA-DAP program, will talk about how specifically the RDCA-DAP platform accomplishes this. And then we'll hear from several other key stakeholders, notably Paul Howard from Amicus, the author of a paper on this topic, Terry Jo Bichell, who represents the patient community, and Madabushi from FDA. So you'll hear a more detailed discussion about the why and more from the patient voice and also from the regulatory community about the necessity of us solving this issue as a community. Now, the motivation for this really comes from, as I mentioned, a recent paper, a publication that was submitted by several key leaders in the field talking about concerns around the issues of data silo and specifically data silos in the rare disease community. So I have a couple excerpts from the paper. I'm not going to read through all of this, and I do encourage you all to take a look at the paper. It's very well written, and I do say the impetus behind this was very much with the intention of raising awareness to this and allowing our entire community to come together and make sure that this is not an impediment to not just data sharing, but to advancing rare disease cures. And I think, again, the intention here was to alert others to the fact that this situation occurs within a variety of settings, certainly in the drug development setting, in the pharmaceutical industry. And in a case where data is so precious to decision-making for rare diseases, we have to guard against this. The notion of a data silo, again, comes from a physical representation of separateness and of really this kind of containered environment. A working definition could just be a collection of data held by one group that is not easily or fully accessible by other groups. So again, this is a key point that the authors made in that publication, that while we're very much enthusiastically supporting patient-level organizations and other organizations trying to collect, curate, and manage rare disease data, we have to also ensure that this ecosystem benefits from all of the data that's being collected and ensures that the data is able to be joined and shared among the entire rare disease stakeholder community. That's something that we need to pay attention to. The graphic on the right illustrates that this, again, is not just a problem in the rare disease space. The industry itself contends with this issue of data silos, and the data silos could be from different parts of the same organization. Say, for instance, data being sequestered within drug discovery as opposed to drug development or different functional groups. I think the industry is used to this concern. They're aware of it. They're taking steps to manage this more efficiently. And you see the report card here. So this is a problem. The good thing, though, is that there is technology to solve this. And the reason it doesn't happen practically is because of social behavior and not so much about the technology. The problem with data silos is that they limit the view of data. They threaten data integrity. So what do I mean by that? Because you have a data that gets put in a common location, if the data is then updated or rescinded, it's not necessarily managed in an appropriate way. So when data is not fully vetted and when there's not a complete audit trail of this and when it's not shared appropriately where this kind of checking can occur in a more robust manner, this is potentially a problem. It's certainly a waste of resources when you have different communities and individuals responsible for different slices of data. So that's both manpower and an expense issue with respect to resource management. And certainly I think we all can appreciate the fact that they discourage collaborative work. One of the whole benefits of the platform we're launching today and in collaboration with the entire stakeholder community is to promote collaboration. You'll see this in the pilot that we're going to take you through, and that's certainly been an expectation of everyone who contributes data. And ultimately, they slow down data-driven decision-making. This is something that's very much on the minds of both rare disease drug developers as well as regulatory authorities. We're expecting to accelerate cures more quickly, and that requires a certain expectation in terms of the efficiency of making this data available in a usable manner. Now, the journey gets even more complicated when we consider rare diseases. I mean, consider what a patient goes through just to have their data provided in any platform. There's a long and tortuous process just to have the data collected, assembled, and put in a usable manner. So this, again, raises the bar in terms of further impediments to sharing rare disease data. So we simply can't allow this. And I think also recognizing that our stakeholder community represents a very diverse number of sectors. So nonprofits, for-profits, academics, they've all created a certain amount of data stores with potentially separate governance, access, and privacy considerations. One of the things I'd say I'm most proud of with this effort is that there's been an awakening of our entire community that we cannot allow this to happen. So colleagues, both from NORD, from organizations such as Allstripes, RareX, Vivly, have recognized that we as a community cannot allow this. So we've had fantastic conversations about preventing data silos and ensuring that the connectivity is there and that we work together to avoid these situations and make sure that there's coordination in every capacity and that we share often, and we share in a meaningful way. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my partner in crime, Amanda Borens, who will walk you through exactly how RDCA-DAP avoids being a data silo. Take it away, Amanda.
Thanks, Jeff. Like he said, I'm Amanda Borens. I'm the Executive Director of Data Science at the Critical Path Institute. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how we're working to avoid being a silo. And the way that we think that works is by adopting FAIR principles. FAIR data principles are something that are really intrinsically tied to the Data Collaboration Center at CPATH for over 15 years now. So findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But I'm going to just walk through a little touch point of examples of how we're hitting each of those checkboxes. So I've worked with a lot of platforms over the years that I've heard some contributors say that their grant funding requires that they share data. They're not really eager to share their data because it's their life's work. So they've put it into these platforms where no one will ever find it. I think that the important point here is that whether that's your intention or not, when you have a large, unorganized warehouse of data, it becomes not findable. So whether that's your intention or not, it often is the result. And so we at CPATH are working hard to avoid being a data warehouse such as that image by making data very searchable. We have a robust searchable metadata catalog. We're working hard to define data dictionaries. We're standardizing variable names. We are building exploration tools that will allow you to not only search for data by keyword or by variable name, it also allows you to explore summary data so that you can see if the population of patients and the age range of patients in a study are particularly going to answer your scientific question. And that helps to make the data findable, but also helps you to narrow your focus so that you're not requesting access to data that may not be helpful. So in that second box, accessibility. We work very hard to make data accessible, and CPATH in particular has really pioneered this concept of pre-negotiating access to data. So many platforms, you might go find your dream data set, and then there's this months-long process of requesting access, writing a stats analysis plan, and then at the end of that, there are a few more weeks or maybe months because the data steward has to actually build that subset of data with only those variables you're allowed to see on the fly. And so at CPATH, we kind of cut through all of that. We do all that work before the data set is ever shared in our platform so that the second you meet the criteria for being able to access data, you have access to the data in a secure workspace. So we have developed legal agreements called data collaboration agreements that touch on some of this. We also have data use agreements and terms and conditions that help protect the data owner and protect the accessor of the data with full audit trails and so forth. But accessibility is something that we feel like we've firmly checked off. Okay, so third category, interoperability. So we make data interoperable by working with a dedicated portion of our data science team called the Ontology, Semantics, and Metadata team. And that team is probably the unsung hero of data science, right? Because all of the work that they do is somewhat invisible. It just makes things better. And so I would say there are two categories of interoperability that we're shooting for. We want to be interoperable with all of the data within our platform. We want it to be interoperable with data from any other platform where possible. And that's one category. But also remember that we're aiming to make data aggregatable across 7,000 or 8,000 rare diseases. We want all of the data to be aggregated in ways that we haven't predefined. So we're not mapping to a physical data model. We're not confining ourselves to a list of variables that we keep and others that we throw away. We are sharing the full data, working hard to make it interoperable by using the latest technologies and semantics such as knowledge graphs and index searches and much more that I won't go into in this short introduction. But we're expecting users to aggregate data in novel ways, and we don't want to hamstring any sort of research by saying that these data sets don't exactly fit together, right? So over the next year, we're going to be focusing pretty heavily on bringing on additional ontology tools, terminologies, for example, that are searchable. But we also allow a user to upload a data set to their workspace and combine it with data that they find in RDCA-DAP. And then the final category that I mentioned is application interfaces. And we'll be learning a lot more today about our first major application interface with the IAMRARE database from NORD. Finally, reusability. So we make data reusable, especially with respect to knowing that this particular study had a predefined scientific question that it was aiming to answer, but that may not be the same question that you as a researcher or scientist or clinician have. And so we work really hard at CPATH for a long time, over 15 years now. We've worked hard at pioneering this idea of making data as reusable as possible and also as valuable for regulatory processes as possible, meaning that we work hard to keep an audit trail of exactly what's happened to data so that if there's some sort of a biomarker that's been identified, it can be taken to regulatory agencies for endorsement, for example. We've worked honestly in the RDCA-DAP specifically to make data reusable by standardizing and cleaning the data, but also getting in touch with some of the owners of the data to clarify questions that would have made the data somewhat unusable. For example, in cases where medications have been recorded in a registry, but no units were given, sometimes you're able to salvage those data. And so we do a lot of work behind the scenes before we even share the data to get it as useful for secondary purposes as possible. And then the other thing that we do is add really robust metadata, as I mentioned before, including the survey form, so that you as a researcher in this secondary purpose, you'll know exactly sort of what the bounds are for where you can make scientific inferences. And with that, I think it's time for us to open up the question and answer panel and talk about whether or not Jeff's definition matches the entire group's definition and whether or not I've satisfied the claim that we will be making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Thank you.
So maybe we could start by having everybody react to what they heard. I'll kick it off with you, Paul. I'm going to start.
Thank you, Jeff and Amanda. I think that's incredibly exciting. I think I had, shared with you before that I think a lot of how we all, the community in the rare disease space, goes about aggregating data and running registries and trials is a lot like setting up an individual airport for a single journey and then shuttering the airport or building a wall around it and locking away the telemetry data so that other folks can't learn from it. And there are a lot of reasons that exists. There are competitive pressures, intellectual property, funding. This is the system we live within, and all of those incentives are rational. But they leave us in a state where we're unable to de-risk key components of the patient journey and the drug development process. And that means a lot of times we might be left with an endpoint that we know is deeply problematic for a drug development program, but we'll use it because we know it's accepted. And we won't do something that's innovative, that's potentially transformative, because it's not de-risked. But if we could use these tools, the ones that you're developing, to de-risk these opportunities, strengthen our understanding of the patient's natural history, aggregate the phenotype and genotypes in important ways that would allow us to stratify trials and run the kinds of trials, the platform trials that we've seen approached in cancer and other spaces, I think that would be a quantum leap. So, I'm very excited about this platform. I'm even more excited about the work that you've already done to bring other voices from Citizen, Allstripes, RareX, and elsewhere into the conversation. And then to continue this by talking about how do we strengthen those incentives or create new incentives so that all the partners have more incentives to bring more data to you and other platforms like this, and do it in a way that meets those FAIR principles that Amanda just spoke about.
That's great, Paul. Really appreciate the comments. Terry, Jo, what about the patient voice? Any thoughts?
Well, I have to say this is something that patients don't think about very often, about how incredibly important it is that their data is available, shareable, and analyzable. But having this happen is one of the most important steps towards getting treatments and cures for rare diseases. I mean, I represent my son, who has Angelman syndrome and is unable to speak, and 25 other disorders, which are centered around rare genetic neurodevelopmental disorders. Most of those children are unable to speak. Their families have to speak for them, and their families have to do what they can absolutely to make sure that these treatments and cures can be available for these kids. And they're in a hurry. Some of these children have regression. Some of them have sudden death during sleep. Some of them have developmental windows for treatment that if we miss it, we will not be able to help them have a better life. And so we don't have time as rare disease patients to let people fight about data. We don't have time as parents of children who are developing every single day to let data sit somewhere in a box where we can't use it to get clinical trials through and clinical trials done well. So in my mind, this is one of the most important things I do as the head of COMBINEDBrain, is to break down these silos. And I'm really excited about what is happening here.
Thank you, Terry Jo. Very powerful statement. I think that's one of the things that I reflect on when I'm working with Alex to secure data. We'll be talking to the head of a foundation who is typically a parent, and you see their child running back and forth behind the Zoom screen. And it's just, this sense of urgency is real. So I appreciate those comments. Raj, how about you from the standpoint of a regulator? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in this panel. Like others who have gone before me, I totally echo the importance of breaking down the silos and having platforms like the data analytics platform cannot be overstated at all. In fact, historically, we have struggled with data silos across the spectrum of all the therapeutic areas. And most of the effort that has gone, and Jeff, you may be aware of some of our disease model related regulatory science research activities that have helped in other areas. Most of the work actually goes on in pulling together the data and bringing it into an analyzable format. That's where, if I'm not wrong, 70 to 80% of effort goes, and it's time taking. And these kinds of challenges, they exist even in this space. But what makes it more that much more challenging, which was stated in several presentations, is that we are dealing in a data paucity environment. We are dealing with, like Terry Jo said, a real urgency on the ground for need to develop therapies. And to be able to do that, personally, I do not see any other way out of this. We have to break these silos. And to this end, I think the tools that you pointed out, Jeff, in your presentation, that could be very useful for de-risking decisions or informing trials or patient selections. All those are dependent upon our ability to take a look at the data, interrogate it, learn from it, and be able to inform trials such that we get meaningful outputs out of those clinical trial experiences and thus advance in this particular area. So I could not have agreed any more with any of the speakers before me or the panelists and their views.
Yeah, Raj, I
I'd
think
like to ask,
Go ahead, Amanda.
sorry, Jeff. No, I'd like to ask if you have any particular advice about whether or not we've done a good job of making sure that these data would be, I hate to use the phrase regulatory grade, but whether or not we've done a good job of ensuring that the data that might be submitted as evidence, are these steps that we've taken enough, first of all? And then the second part of my question is just thoughts about what patient groups collecting data for registries, what can they do to make sure that the FDA actually considers their data valuable, all that work and time that they invest?
Sure. Excellent questions. And I'm not sure I will be able to come up with an answer that might be highly satisfactory, but I'll try to give it a shot here. I think the steps that you presented in your presentation, they all represent the kind of good practice principles that we have historically thought for regulatory submissions, for example, to a good extent. So I think that's a very good step. So it remains to be seen what comes out of it and go through a particular regulatory kind of an interaction. But something that I can probably talk about a little bit is how information comes through. For example, what we have is a fit for purpose initiative, which is an initiative for trying to figure out or evaluate the regulatory acceptance of some of these tools that Jeff was talking about, right? You have this information about the disease, its progression, and the understanding from different past clinical trials, right? You develop these models and then you develop tools so that you will be able to inform. So based on those experiences, what we have seen is, I want to say, I will not be able to put an exact number, but there is some conversation that goes on in trying to understand what is the data behind it and how that has been curated and analyzed to be able to inform some of these models that may translate into the potential applications that everyone can use, because once these are accepted, these can be used by any drug developers, for example. Right. So from that perspective, having data in with a governance structure that you laid out and having these good data practice attributes associated with it will actually go a long way in helping facilitate the conversations to really evaluate some of these tools, which are actually based on this foundation of the data. I don't know if that helped address.
No, I think it does. I mean, I think we work really hard to make sure that we have version controlled scripts that run to curate data so that you see the raw data and you can see exactly what's happened to the data before producing an analysis subset that we submit, right? So I think transparency and auditing are important, but then more on the second point, Raj, we have worked pretty hard with partners at NORD and other places actually to collect registry data. And what we've found is not really clear guidance. And maybe Terry Jo, you can jump in on this topic as well. I think not really clear guidance. One of my concerns about collecting data for rare diseases is that that involves the patient so much of the time, right? And the definition of the word registry is such a broad term. It covers so many things, and sometimes collected in very rigorous, standardized ways from hospitals. But in the case of parents uploading data for their patients, right? Is there guidance in it? And if we were unable to find guidance that would help those patient groups, is that something that we at CDAP could help with, to submit guidance for collecting good registry data?
Yeah,
I'd love to jump in.
absolutely. I think.
Yeah.
There is
Go ahead, Paul.
there is a process for submitting. I think that's a fantastic idea, Amanda. There is a process for submitting a potential draft guidance to the agency, and I think the angle that you just outlined, and I'd love to hear Debbie's perspective, is that, you know, in effect, that you can start to outline what good looks like in a given context, and then bring it to the agency. I don't want to speak for the agency. I used to work at the agency, but I can't speak for them. But I think a lot of times, operating a use case that gives them an idea of what kind of decision you're trying to inform opens up a potential dialogue that I think will be really useful. And I think it is incredibly helpful, especially if you can bring those examples to them, develop a guidance, and then if it works, that can become a platform for the whole community to understand what good looks like for registries.
Terry
Terry
Jo,
Jo, yeah.
Basically, I was just going to say what he said. We would love that kind of guidance so that we could actually adhere to it. I think the patient communities know that the data is their voice, and they work hard to try to start collecting data. And it's absolutely tragic when the data cannot be used.
Right.
So if we can give them that kind of guidance and do our best to have everyone collecting data in such a way that it can really be useful forever, then that would be enormously helpful.
Yeah.
one of the things that comes through in both Raj's comments and even Teresa's earlier comments was this expectation of quality. And I think that's something that this issue of data silos, while it may be implicit in there, it's a key part of this. I mean, we accept data of very diverse types. It's like a big flour sifter, and you can think of the person turning the crank as Amanda's team. They're working hard to ingest that data, make it available in putting forward the standards and the appropriate quality aspects so that we can have conditions on the data. So tools that we're able to build that Raj mentioned can be used with high fidelity. So there's a process in place through all of this. It's connected, but I think the expectation of quality has to be there, and we don't get to accelerate things unless that's put in place. So I think Amanda had a good comment in terms of what else we could do, but maybe one final question on that regard. From the standpoint of working with this ecosystem, do you feel we've done enough? And what else do you think we should do to ensure that the good vibrations of the day continue? Any thoughts?
I'd like to say that I think that this is not easy. It's going to always keep being a process. One of the most important things to do is involve even small pools of data right away so that people, groups, platforms, clinicians, researchers can actually see how pooling data, even small pools of data, will actually lead toward publications and towards improvements in treatment and drug development. And so I think one of the things that is really important for us at COMBINEDBrain is to start using this immediately, even with tiny bits of data. And those end up becoming the tip of the iceberg and showing people how to share, how to work together, how to collaborate, how to publish. And so then the database can grow bigger and bigger and bigger in a good, clean way.
Yeah.
Great.
I see a lot of nodding from Paul. Would you like to jump in and tell us?
I think that's a fantastic suggestion. 100% agree. I'd also add, whenever you can, bring us together, bring the industry, the clinicians, the academic community, the agency together, and try and find opportunities for us to kind of solve problems that we have in common and continue to demonstrate, because I think we've seen a tremendous potential, but continue to demonstrate the platform in spaces that as I think Jeff alluded to it earlier. You could look at a clinical outcomes, or it was Teresa, I think, clinical outcomes assessment that could apply to multiple rare diseases. But how can we understand that in the context of, a patient function, but also a potential biomarker, a clinician assessment, or a patient assessment through a PRO? And if we can start to understand how they apply, and if they're all pointing in the same direction, I think we can start to get excited about better understanding and stratifying those rare disease populations, even across multiple different potential disease states, but that we can produce a tool that will be highly valuable to the community.
Great comment, Paul. We got a couple questions from the chat. One in particular, I want to see if I can get Raj to comment on. Raj, there was a question: will FDA proactively evaluate data in the platform for use in regulatory decision-making and share their assessment with stakeholders? So anyway, this is a comment from the chat, but they basically make the further point that it would be critically important that we don't spend time seeking regulatory review, feedback, and acceptance of the data for a specific context of use. Any reaction to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would like to reiterate here that the Fit for Purpose initiative that we have is specifically aimed to address situations of this nature, the kind of tools for a specific context that are developed to help inform drug development programs agnostic to an individual drug at interest, but in a given area. If you go on to our website, you will see we already have one in the area of Alzheimer's disease to inform patient selection, as well as how to enrich, as well as how to conduct the trials in a certain very defined setting in Alzheimer's disease. So I'm thinking the outputs such as these kinds of tools that come out with these kinds of contexts, if and when they go through that kind of the program, the output of that is regulatory acceptance of that particular tool in that particular context. So when these tools are utilized, let's say in a specific drug development program, our aim is not to reiterate the conversation that happened in ascertaining the regulatory acceptance of that particular tool. So exactly that particular program that is there is aimed at accelerating drug development and across different therapeutic areas. And definitely there is a tremendous opportunity in the rare disease space to be able to realize those kinds of benefits of having these tools that can be now routinely be implemented in drug development, and thereby focus on other questions as opposed to reviewing what went behind that particular tool that was being used, because that would have received a regulatory acceptance for that particular context of use and stipulated application.
And I will say FDA has been a fantastic partner in this. We've already initiated a number of pilots. They've been very much engaged, worked with academic stakeholders in addition to members of foundations. So again, we're just opening the doors. This is day one. We're expecting this to continue, but it's going to be a little bit daunting with 7,000 rare diseases, but we'll do everything we can. So Amanda, I'm going to give you the final word.
Well, I want to touch on a particular question here in the chat, because I intended to talk about not just APIs, but federated access. And so one of the questions was, will you also allow federated access in bidirectional ways? And the answer to that is yes. We're already, actually, if you were up in the middle of the night in the US, you would have seen that we were also participating in the European Joint Program on Rare Diseases annual conference, and talking exactly about that, this plan for, we would love to have federated access between the European platform and the US platform to expand the representation of patients. Federation and APIs, a mild but really important in my world difference is that federation means that we have to agree on an underlying data structure in order to be able to move cleanly back and forth in both directions. But that's something that we're tackling for sure. And I guess the last, since you've given me the last word, Jeff, I think the last word is just to reiterate what you said. We're an ecosystem. We're not a silo. And also, this is day one, but this is not the end. This is the beginning, right? This is a marathon that we're planning to stick with for a really long time. So thanks to everybody for participating.
Yes, great job.